By the time the lamps are lit and the shop shutters pulled down, there is another London beginning to stir, one that polite society preferred not to name, let alone look at for too long. This is not the London of gaslight glamour or grand boulevards, but a city lived from the pavement upward, from the gutter inward. When I first came across the word crawler in Victorian sources, it stopped me cold. It sounded almost cruel in its bluntness, and that was precisely the point. This was a term Londoners used for women who had fallen so far through the city's social net that walking itself had become uncertain. Tonight, I want to walk you into that world carefully, because it tells us something essential about Victorian London that statistics and reform speeches never quite managed to capture. This is a story about visibility and invisibility at the same time, about bodies on the street that everyone saw and yet trained themselves not to see at all. If you're here for this kind of history, the slow, uncomfortable humankind, this is your moment to subscribe. This channel is for people who want more than dates and names, who want to understand how a city actually felt to live inside. And while you're here, leave a comment telling me where you're listening from. A quiet room, a night shift, another city entirely. I read every one, and it genuinely shapes how I imagine these stories travelling outward from London's streets. The women, known as crawlers, did not appear suddenly, nor were they the product of a single moral failing, as Victorian commentators were so fond of insisting. They were the end result of pressures that built up over years: irregular work, illness, drink, violence, age, and the brutal economics of survival in a city that had little patience for anyone who slowed down. By the mid-19th century, London had swollen to well over 2 million people, drawing in young women from rural England and Ireland, with promises of work as servants, seamstresses, factory hands. Many found employment, at least at first, but domestic service was precarious, and dismissal could be instant. A single accusation, a pregnancy, an illness, or even perceived insolence could put a woman on the street with no reference and no savings. Once that happened, the slide downward could be frighteningly fast. What made crawlers distinct in the Victorian imagination was not simply that they sold sex, because prostitution in London was both widespread and grudgingly tolerated. It was the condition in which they did so. Crawlers were women who, according to police reports and medical observers, wandered the streets late at night, visibly intoxicated, exhausted, ill or injured, sometimes unable to stand upright for long. They leaned against walls, sat on curbstones, or quite literally crawled along the pavement when their legs gave out. Contemporary observers described them with a mixture of pity, disgust, and fascination. These were not the brightly dressed figures of music hall caricature. They were often poorly clothed, shoes broken or missing, hair unkempt, faces swollen from drink or disease. Their presence unsettled Victorians, precisely because it was so hard to pretend they were choosing this life freely. Police constables encountered crawlers nightly, especially in districts like Whitechapel, Holborn, the Strand, and along the river. The Metropolitan Police kept careful notes, not out of compassion, but because crawlers were considered both a public nuisance and a moral danger. A woman found lying in the street could be arrested for drunkenness, disorderly conduct, or soliciting. Yet even within the system, there was an uneasy recognition that arrest solved nothing. Locking a crawler up overnight meant she would be back on the street the next evening, weaker than before. Some officers quietly admitted that these women were more likely to die than to reform, and their reports often read like obituaries written in advance. Medical men added another layer to the story. Victorian doctors, especially those working in hospitals and workhouse infirmaries, began to identify crawlers as a category of patient. They described women admitted with advanced syphilis, liver disease, malnutrition, frostbite, and chronic alcoholism. Many were in their 40s or 50s, an age by which a woman's earning power in prostitution had sharply declined. Youth sold. Age struggled. The crawler was often a woman who had once been able to pass as respectable or at least discreet, but who no longer had the strength or appearance to attract safer clients or negotiate better terms. The body itself had become worn down by years of walking, standing, waiting, and being used. What's important to understand is that Victorian London was intensely moralistic on the surface, but ruthlessly pragmatic underneath. Reformers wrote pamphlets decrying the fallen woman, while the city quietly relied on her labour. Men of all classes bought sex. Landlords rented rooms by the hour. Gin shops stayed open late. The crawler represented the point at which this system broke down, when a woman could no longer sustain the illusion of control. That breakdown was embarrassing for a society that liked its vice contained and orderly. Crawlers disrupted the visual landscape. They slumped in doorways, blocked pavements, cried out, fell asleep in public view. They forced passers-by to confront the cost of a system that otherwise functioned smoothly. Charitable organizations attempted to intervene, with mixed success. Rescue homes promised shelter, food, and moral reform, but they usually demanded sobriety, obedience, and religious instruction in return. For a woman deep in addiction or illness, these requirements could be impossible to meet. Others simply did not trust institutions that had a habit of separating mothers from children or imposing long confinements. Night refugees offered a bed for a few pennies, but space was limited and competition fierce. Many crawlers preferred to stay on the streets where, despite the danger, they retained some freedom of movement and the chance, however slim, of earning money quickly. Winter was especially lethal. Cold exacerbated disease, and alcohol became both a coping mechanism and a killer. Reports from particularly harsh winters describe women found frozen to death in alleyways or collapsed near public houses. Newspapers occasionally ran brief notices, anonymous and unemotional, marking these deaths as inevitable. There was rarely an inquest unless foul play was suspected. A crawler's death did not disrupt the machinery of the city. Another woman would take her place, younger, healthier, not yet worn down enough to collapse in public. What strikes me most, reading these accounts, is how well documented this suffering was, and how little changed as a result. Victorians were obsessive record keepers. They counted arrests, hospital admissions, deaths. They classified. Women named them, described them in detail. And yet, the crawler remained a fixture of London life for decades. She was discussed endlessly and helped sparingly. Sympathy rarely translated into structural change. Employment opportunities for older women remained scarce. Housing remained expensive and overcrowded. Drink remained cheap and ubiquitous. In many ways, the crawler was not a failure of morality, but a predictable outcome of the city as it was organized. As we move deeper into this story, I want you to hold on to that idea. Crawlers were not an anomaly lurking at the edges of Victorian London. They were produced by its centre, by the way work, gender, health, and respectability intersected. In the next part, we're going to move closer still, into the nightly routines of these women, the streets they walked, the dangers they navigated, and the small decisions that determined whether they survived another night or disappeared without a trace. This is where the story becomes even more intimate and harder to look away from. If we follow them into the night, really follow them, what becomes clear very quickly is that there was nothing random about how crawlers moved through London. Their routes were shaped by exhaustion, memory, and a hard-earned understanding of where a woman might survive until morning. Certain streets acted like magnets, wide enough to allow loitering without immediate arrest, busy enough to offer potential clients, dim enough to provide cover. The women drifted along these corridors, not aimlessly, but with a battered kind of purpose. They knew which public houses would tolerate them leaning in the doorway, which shopkeepers would shout them away, which alleys offered shelter from rain, but also carried the risk of assault. Every step was a calculation made by someone already running on very little strength. Most crawlers emerged after full dark, when respectability retreated indoors and policing became uneven. Gas lamps cast long, uneven pools of light that left entire stretches of pavement in shadow. In districts like Whitechapel and Holborn, the contrast was especially sharp. Main roads glowed weakly, while side streets dissolved into darkness. Crawlers positioned themselves at the edges of these worlds, close enough to be seen, far enough to disappear quickly if threatened. Many were already drunk by the time they arrived, not because drunkenness made their work easier, but because it dulled hunger, cold, and pain. Gin was cheap, potent, and everywhere. It filled the gap where food should have been, and blurred the passage of hours that might otherwise stretch unbearably long. The physical act of walking itself was often a struggle. Contemporary medical observers noted how many crawlers suffered from swollen joints, untreated injuries, and chronic infections that made standing painful. Shoes wore out quickly on London's stone streets, and replacing them was rarely a priority when food and drink competed for the same coins. Some women wrapped rags around their feet. Others went barefoot, even in winter, their soles thickened and cracked. The name crawler was not always metaphorical. Police records describe women found moving on hands and knees after collapsing, too weak or drunk to rise again. These moments were usually met not with aid, but with arrest, if the constable judged them capable of being moved at all. Clients, when they came, were unpredictable. A crawler had little power to choose. Men who sought them out often did so because they were cheaper, desperate, and less likely to report violence. Payment might be a few pennies, a drink, or nothing at all. Encounters took place in doorways, alleys, or rented rooms paid for by the hour. Violence was common and rarely punished. A woman injured in such an encounter had few options. Hospitals might refuse admission unless her condition was dire. Workhouse infirmaries were dreaded, associated with confinement and loss of autonomy. Many crawlers treated wounds themselves or relied on informal networks of other women who shared knowledge about cheap remedies and sympathetic surgeons. There was a strange, fragile social world among crawlers, built on proximity rather than trust. Women watched out for one another in small ways, warning of aggressive men or police sweeps, sharing information about a public house that had just been raided, or a refugee rumoured to have space. At the same time, competition was fierce. Another woman meant fewer clients, less money, more risk. Friendships formed and dissolved quickly, often strained by drink and desperation. Still, these fleeting alliances mattered. Isolation was dangerous. A woman alone was easier to assault, easier to overlook if she collapsed, easier to forget if she died. The police loomed over everything. Officially, constables were meant to maintain order, not to provide care. Crawlers existed in a grey zone of enforcement, too visible to ignore, too numerous to remove entirely. Arrests spiked during moral, panics or reform campaigns, then tapered off when prisons filled or public attention shifted elsewhere. Some officers exercised discretion, steering women toward shelters or simply moving them along. Others were brutal, using force to clear streets quickly. A night in a police cell could mean warmth and temporary safety, but it also carried risks: humiliation, withdrawal from alcohol, exposure to disease, and release back onto the streets with no support. Morning was not relief. Dawn revealed bodies that night had concealed. Women who had managed to stay upright now slumped against buildings, faces grey with exhaustion. Street cleaners washed away the previous day's refuse, sometimes prodding sleeping figures to see if they were alive. Respectable Londoners stepped around them, eyes averted. The city's rhythm reasserted itself. Offices opened. Shops unlocked their doors. Crawlers either faded into side streets or remained where they were, waiting for night to return. There was no clear boundary between night work and day rest. Sleep came in fragments, stolen wherever possible, always vulnerable to interruption. Illness crept in slowly, then all at once. Syphilis, tuberculosis, liver disease, and chronic bronchitis appear again and again in hospital registers. Many crawlers delayed seeking treatment until collapse forced the issue. By then, intervention was often too late. Doctors wrote clinically about wasted bodies and irreparable damage, but beneath the language is a sense of inevitability. These were patients they expected to lose. Discharge often meant returning to the street, weaker than before. Hospitals could patch up injuries, but they could not undo years of deprivation. What complicates the picture further is age. Crawlers were not exclusively old, but aging accelerated on the streets. A woman in her 30s might already be described as worn out, her health broken beyond repair. Once a crawler, upward movement was rare. The Victorian economy offered few paths back to stability for women with damaged reputations and declining strength. Respectability was not easily reclaimed. Even charities that spoke of redemption quietly prioritized younger women who still fit their vision of reformable femininity. The emotional toll is harder to trace, but no less real. Contemporary observers sometimes noted how crawlers seemed indifferent to danger, even to death. This was not courage, it was exhaustion. A kind of numbness settled in, reinforced by drink and disappointment. Yet moments of clarity broke through. Letters dictated to missionaries, fragments of testimony recorded by reformers, reveal flashes of regret, anger, and longing. Some women spoke of children lost to the workhouse system, of families who believed them dead, of villages they had left years earlier and could never return to. The city swallowed these stories whole, leaving little trace beyond a few lines in an archive. What I keep coming back to is how exposed these women were, and how deliberate that exposure was. Crawlers existed in public view, their suffering on display, yet their lives were structured so that escape was nearly impossible. The streets that kept them alive also trapped them. Visibility did not lead to protection. It led to regulation, judgment, and eventual erasure. Victorian London prided itself on progress, order, and moral seriousness, and yet, night after night, it stepped over bodies it had no plan to save. In the next part, we're going to look at how the city talked about crawlers, how reformers, journalists, and officials framed them, and why those narratives mattered so much. Because words shaped policy, and policy shaped who was allowed to survive. This is where compassion and control become tangled, and where good intentions often produced devastating results. By the time most Victorians encountered the word crawler, it was no longer just a description, it was a label loaded with assumptions. Language mattered enormously in how the city justified its response, or lack of one. Newspapers, reform pamphlets, and parliamentary reports returned to the same phrases over and over: degraded, hopeless, irreclaimable. These words did quiet work. They flattened individual lives into a single moral category and made it easier to treat suffering as inevitable. When I read these texts closely, what stands out isn't only their severity, but their confidence. So many writers were certain they understood who these women were, what they deserved, and how their stories would end. Journalists played a major role in shaping public perception. Sensational reporting thrived in the Victorian press, and crawlers offered a perfect subject. They embodied urban decay, moral panic, and the dangers of unchecked vice. Articles described women rolling helplessly in the gutter or haunting the streets like spectres, language that blurred the line between human being and warning sign. These pieces often claimed to expose hidden truths, yet they rarely included the voices of the women themselves. Crawlers appeared as objects to be observed, not people to be understood. The city consumed these stories with a mix of horror and reassurance. Horror at the depths on display, reassurance that such depths were safely distant from respectable life. Reformers approached crawlers with a different tone, but often reached similar conclusions. Evangelical campaigners and social investigators walked the streets at night, notebooks in hand, documenting what they saw. Some were genuinely moved. They described women who were sick, starving, and frightened. They argued that no moral reform could succeed without material support, food, shelter, medical care. Yet even among the most sympathetic voices, there was a hierarchy of worth. Crawlers were frequently described as the hardest cases, the least likely to respond to help. Efforts were better spent, reformers argued, on younger women, those who had not yet lost all self-respect. The crawler became the limit case, the example used to justify exclusion. This thinking fed directly into policy. Victorian Britain loved classification. Poor laws, public health acts, policing strategies all depended on sorting people into categories that determined their treatment. Crawlers sat awkwardly within these systems. They were poor, but not always eligible for relief unless they entered the workhouse. They were sick, but not always welcome in hospitals unless they were dying. They were criminalized, but prisons offered no solution beyond temporary containment. Each institution passed responsibility to the next. In practice, this meant the streets remained the default place of care, however lethal that care might be. The workhouse loomed large in these discussions. For many, crawlers, it was both a refuge of last resort and a place of terror. Entering meant surrendering freedom, being separated by gender, sometimes losing contact with children entirely. Conditions varied, but stigma was universal. Victorian culture treated the workhouse as a moral test. To accept its help was to admit failure. Crawlers who refused it were condemned as willful. Those who entered were condemned as broken. Either way, the system confirmed its own judgments. Medical authorities added scientific weight to these moral narratives. The rise of social medicine and statistics gave doctors new authority to speak about populations rather than individuals. Crawlers were described in terms of degeneration and decline. Alcoholism was framed not only as a habit, but as a hereditary weakness. Disease was evidence of moral collapse as much as physical harm. These ideas mattered because they shaped expectations. A woman labelled incurable was unlikely to receive sustained care. Temporary. Relief was justified. Long-term investment was not. And yet, cracks appeared even in these rigid frameworks. Some observers noticed patterns that challenged simple moral explanations. They saw how injury led to unemployment, unemployment to homelessness, homelessness to drink. They noted how violence pushed women out of safer forms of prostitution into more dangerous street work. They recognized how aging narrowed options until the street was all that remained. These insights rarely translated into policy, but they linger in the margins of reports, hints of an understanding that the problem was structural, not individual. Public anxiety about crawlers peaked during moments of visibility. Cold winters, economic downturns, or highly publicized deaths brought them briefly into focus. Parliamentary questions were asked, committees convened, promises made. Then attention drifted. The women themselves did not disappear, but their suffering receded back into the background noise of the city. Victorian London was remarkably good at absorbing distress without changing its shape. What makes this especially unsettling is how often compassion was paired with control. Night shelters imposed strict rules. Rescue homes demanded moral compliance. Police surveillance increased under the banner of protection. Help came with conditions that many crawlers, already exhausted and ill, could not meet. Failure was taken as proof that they were beyond saving. The system created obstacles, then pointed to those obstacles as evidence of moral weakness. As I move through these sources, I'm struck by how familiar some of these arguments feel. The language has changed, but the logic remains recognizable. Who is deemed worthy of help? Who is written off as a lost cause? How suffering is tolerated when it can be framed as deserved? Crawlers force us to confront these questions in a particularly raw form because their lives unfolded so publicly and ended so quietly. In the final part, I want to slow down even further and look at endings. What happened to crawlers when the streets finally released them? Through death, institutionalization, or the rare escape? How were they remembered, if at all? And what does their disappearance tell us about the kind of city Victorian London was, and the kind of city it chose to be? This is where the story closes, but it's also where its meaning sharpens. By the time a crawler vanished from the streets of London, it was rarely dramatic. There were no crowds, no headlines, no sudden reckoning. More often, disappearance came quietly, through exhaustion, illness, or a single night when the body simply failed to rise again. A woman who had been seen nightly for years might be noticed absent for a time, then forgotten. If she died in a hospital or workhouse infirmary, her death was recorded in ledgers with spare efficiency. Name, age, cause. If she died outside, the record might be thinner still. A constable's note, a burial arranged by the parish. A body returned to the city with minimal ceremony. London absorbed these endings without pause. Some crawlers ended their days in institutions, though ended is the key word here. Chronic illness pushed many into infirmaries, where long-term care was limited, and expectations low. Doctors described them as incurable cases, suitable for comfort rather than recovery. Others were confined in workhouses, where strict discipline governed daily life. For women already worn down by years of instability, this environment could be crushing. Yet for a small number, it meant warmth, regular meals, and a bed that was theirs for longer than a night. Survival came at the cost of autonomy, and Victorian society considered that a fair exchange. There were rare exceptions. A handful of women did manage to step out of the role of crawler, usually through a combination of chance, intervention, and sheer resilience. A sympathetic employer willing to overlook reputation. A charitable home that accepted an older woman without unrealistic conditions. A relative who had not entirely closed the door. These stories exist, but they are exceptional precisely because the system was not designed to produce them. Escape required the alignment of circumstances that seldom occurred for someone already weakened by years on the streets. Children complicate the picture further. Some crawlers had sons, or daughters living elsewhere, often in workhouses, industrial schools, or foster arrangements. Separation was common and often permanent. A mother's decline rarely translated into family reunification. Records show women asking after children they would never see again, or refusing institutional help because it required formal separation. Victorian authorities treated motherhood among poor women as a problem to be managed rather than a bond to be preserved. For crawlers, this meant that even the strongest emotional ties offered little protection against erasure. Memory did not serve these women well. Unlike reformers, philanthropists, or notorious criminals, crawlers left few personal traces. They wrote little that survived. They owned almost nothing. Their stories remain fragmented across police reports, hospital admissions, and charitable case notes. Documents never meant to preserve voice or perspective. What we know comes filtered through the language of authority. And yet, even through that filter, patterns emerge clearly enough to demand attention. The crawler was not an aberration. She was a foreseeable outcome of how Victorian London structured labour, gender and care. What stays with me most is the contradiction at the heart of the city. London prided itself on progress, order and improvement. It invested heavily in infrastructure, policing, sanitation and governance. And yet it tolerated a level of visible suffering that it could have mitigated but chose not to. Crawlers were not hidden in slums beyond reach. They lay on main roads, near theatres, markets and places of power. Their presence was a daily reminder of what happened when people fell out of usefulness, when their bodies could no longer keep pace with the city's demands. Victorians often spoke of moral lessons. Crawlers were held up as warnings, examples of where vice led. But the lesson cuts the other way too. These women show us the limits of individual responsibility in a system stacked against the vulnerable. They expose how easily moral language can be used to excuse structural neglect. And they remind us that visibility alone does not guarantee care. A society can look directly at suffering and still decide it is acceptable. As I've worked through this material, I've been struck by how modern some of these debates feel. Who deserves help? Under what conditions? How much autonomy the desperate are allowed? Crawlers force us to confront the cost of conditional compassion. Help that arrives too late, or only if the recipient changes first, is often no help at all. Victorian London learned this lesson repeatedly and failed to act on it in any sustained way. There is a temptation to see this story as safely contained in the past. Gas lamps replaced by electric light, workhouses dismantled, policing reformed, and yet the underlying dynamics remain familiar. Cities still produce people who move through public space visibly unwell, exhausted and marginalized. Language still hardens around them. Labels still do quiet work. The crawler may be a Victorian term, but the condition it described has never entirely disappeared. Ending this story is difficult because there is no neat resolution to offer, no triumphant reform that sweeps in at the last moment. The crawlers of Victorian London did not trigger a moral awakening that transformed the city. They were absorbed, managed, forgotten. And perhaps that is precisely why they matter. They show us what a society is willing to live with when change is inconvenient and compassion comes with conditions. If there's one thing I hope stays with you after this, it's the idea that history is not only made by those who leave monuments or memoirs. It is also shaped by those whose lives were worn down quietly, whose absence went largely unremarked, but whose existence tells us uncomfortable truths about the world they inhabited. The crawlers remind us that progress is not measured only by what a city builds, but by who it allows to fall away. If you've stayed with me to the end of this story, thank you. This channel exists because there are people willing to sit with history in its messier, more human forms. If you haven't already, subscribe so we can keep exploring these overlooked corners together. And if you want to share where you're listening from, or what part of this story stayed with you, I'd love to read it. These conversations matter, and they're what keep this work going.